So elasticities, yeah. So this, we looked at price elasticity of demand, PED, in our first lesson, and we looked at income elasticity of demand in our first lesson as well. And this lesson, we're going to look into cross elasticity of demand. So looking at the relationship between two goods, and also the price elasticity of supply. Yeah. So just bear in mind that the IB syllabus does not cover the cross elasticity of demand anymore. Okay, and that's for the newest IB syllabus, and that's published in 2020. Yeah. So complements. So before we talked about cross elasticity of demand, we need to look at complements and substitutes. So let's have a think about what complements are. If you have, say, to reduce the price of one of your products in your store, would you rather own a fruit store or would you rather own a vegetable store? So those two might seem very similar to each other, but actually there is a preferable store to own in this situation where you have to decrease the price of one of your products. Don't ask me whether tomatoes are a type of fruit or a type of vegetable, because I'm not sure. I think they are a type of fruit, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. Because I think that if like you have got like a flowering body, then it's like a fruit, right? Or maybe I'm just being a total ignorant biologist here. But anyway, so yeah, have a guess. Would you rather own a fruit store or a vegetable store? I'll give you 3 seconds. So actually, in this case, you would rather own a vegetable store. So why is that? If you have to decrease the price of one of your products in a vegetable store, such as like lettuce, then actually people would buy more lettuce, right? And as a result, because they're buying more lettuce, they might buy more other vegetables if they're making like a salad or something. So you can see that the vegetables that you're selling are complements to each other. If you've got vegetables and tomatoes in the same salad, the overall value of your salad would increase. So this is what we call complementary goods. When the goods consumed together would provide additional overall value as a whole, instead of like consuming them on their own. So from this example, we can figure out that if there's a fall in the price of one good, it would increase the demand for the other good if those goods are complementary to each other. So similarly, you see here we've got some salad dressing. So if the price of salad decreases, then the demand for salad dressing would increase, because people would just buy more salad dressing in order to go with their tasty and cheaper salad, right? So yeah, that's complements in a nutshell, basically. And I'm not sure if you guys have tried some of the Japanese salad dressing. Those are like really nice. But yeah, do look them up, and I think they're quite easy to make as well. But what cross elasticity of demand looks at is it measures the responsiveness of the demand for one good given the change in price of another. And it looks at the relationship between the two goods. So again, if the two goods are complements, then they're going to have a negative cross elasticity of demand. So here's the formula here, then you can just write it out. So you would probably have seen it in this format if you are studying A-level or IB economics. In quantity demanded for good A. And divided by the percentage change in price of good B. So as we can see here, if we take the tomatoes and lettuce example, if the price of lettuce decreases, then it's going to have a negative percentage change, right? So negative percentage change. And if the demand for tomatoes increases because the price of lettuce decreases, then we're going to have a positive price change. So as a result, the overall figure for XED is going to be negative for complements, because a fall in the price of good B would actually lead to more people buying good B and also more people buying good A. But if we put it into this equation, it's always going to end up to be negative if the two goods are complementary. So let's do an example together. We've got lettuce, pineapples, and tomatoes in this case, for Sestria, wherever that is. So we're asked to calculate the cross elasticity of demand between lettuce and tomatoes throughout this period. So again, if we just think of the formula here, what do we have? We've got XED is how sensitive the quantity demanded is for tomatoes in response to change to the price of lettuce. So it'll be the percentage change in quantity demanded for tomatoes in response to a fall in the price of lettuce, right, in this case. So percentage change in price for lettuce. So again, if you recall correctly, the change or the percentage change can be calculated by the new value minus the old value divided by the old value of the thing times it by 100%. Yeah. So maybe I shouldn't have put that there. I just put that here instead. Okay, so 100% times the new value minus the old value divided by the old value. So this is the percentage change formula. So first we want to calculate the percentage change in the quantity demanded for tomatoes throughout this period after the price of lettuce has decreased. So we can see the percentage change or the quantity demanded for tomatoes has increased from 100 to 150. So we just do the new value, which is 150, minus the old value of 100, and then we divide that by 100 times about 100%, then that's going to be what? 50 divided by 100, 1 over 2, so that's plus 50%. So we can see it has increased by 50% in terms of the demand for tomatoes, and we can do the same for the price for lettuce. So we do, we see the lettuce price has decreased from $8 to $6, yeah? So new value, which is $6, minus the old value of $8 divided by 8 times 100%, and then again we're gonna have 1 over 4, so it'll be negative 25%. Because 6 minus 8 would give you negative 2, so that's why you're gonna get negative 25%. So overall, the answer would just be 50% divided by minus 25%. So you see that in this case, it is minus 2.0. So usually we would have one decimal place for the elasticity, but it's okay to just put it as minus 2 as well. And what this means is that since the XED is negative, the goods must be complementary. Yeah. So tomatoes and lettuce will be complements for each other. So meaning if you buy more lettuce, you most likely would want more tomatoes. And if the price of lettuce decreases, you would buy more lettuce and hence buy more tomatoes. So again, because we've got one positive number and one negative number, so then you would end up with minus 2. Okay. So to interpret this number, this basically just means that if the price of lettuce decreases by 25%, people would demand 50% more tomatoes. XED is negative when they're complements, but positive when it is opposite of a complement, right? So the opposite of a complement would be a substitute, which we would jump into later. But for complements, it also works the other way around. So for example, you've got printers here, and I really hate printers, and the reason being is because for some printers, if you run out of ink for just one type of color, then the printer won't print. So let's say if you ran out of ink for yellow, then you won't basically be able to print anything, even though you know there is color for cyan or whatever. So that's really annoying, and because of this, I might not actually buy printers that require all inks to be present. But anyway, if we go back to the complements again, if say the price of printer ink increases for that particular brand, say Brother in this case, then most likely I would buy less printers from Brother, from the same brand. And that's because I don't want to pay an additional amount for their ink after I obtain the printer, because I need the same printer ink brand to work. So therefore, similarly, if the, let's say if good A would be the printer in this case, and good B would be the printer ink, so if the I'll just write out the formula here as well. Yeah. So if the price of printer ink, which is here, goes up, so again this would be a positive percentage change because the price of printer ink is going up. But that means I would be buying less printer ink, and I wouldn't want to buy as many printers since I know that I need to buy the ink in the future. So therefore the demand for the printers will actually go down. Yeah. So then it would be negative percentage change for good A, even though it is a positive price change for good B. And as a result, again, we get a negative XED, right? So this is the other way around, because we are buying less of the other good because there's an increase in price of good A, good B, yeah. So we're buying less of good A because of the increase in price in good B. So no matter how you try to interpret this, whenever the goods are complements, they're going to have a negative XED. So just keep that in mind, and that would be quite useful later on for our questions. Okay, so that's pretty much about complements, and now let's look into the opposite of complements, which are substitutes. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about e-cigarettes and smoking as well, and that you're being told not to smoke at school, which I definitely agree, because it harms your health. But you can see that actually a lot of US high school students are starting to vape or use e-cigarettes instead of smoking. And you can see here when the usage or the percentage use of tobacco and e-cigarettes increases, the consumption of cigarettes has actually decreased throughout the same period. So potentially the US high school students are basically vaping instead of smoking, and I doubt that they're doing the same. I doubt that they're smoking and vaping at the same time. That would be probably too extreme, even for them. So we can see here that most likely the two goods would be substitutes. So that just means that if you vape, most likely you won't smoke, and also the other way around. If you smoke, most likely you won't vape, and one good would replace the other one. So we see here that a lot of kids are starting to vape, using it with different flavors. However, there are actually also lung illnesses associated with vaping. So probably best to avoid that unless you don't want to live a very long life. And yeah, so this article basically looks at how profits from cigarette companies might actually decrease because of the trend of an increase in the number of people vaping. And I think some tobacco company has managed to acquire and buy out some e-cigarette companies as well in order to maintain their profitability. So, like we said, cigarettes and e-cigarettes are substitute goods. And the consumption of one of them would replace the need for the other. And therefore, if we consume more cigarettes, most likely we would demand less e-cigarettes. So if we look at the price of one good, if the price of e-cigarettes fall, this means that we will buy more e-cigarettes and consume more of e-cigarettes and demand less cigarettes. Yeah. So this means that it would have positive cross elasticity of demand, as you will see later. And one reason or one way to justify why the price of e-cigarettes are cheaper is simply because they are cheaper. So you can use the e-liquid for a longer period of time, and also you don't actually need to pay as much tax for when you buy cigarettes. So we aren't actually taxing e-cigarettes and vapes at the moment, which we probably should, and there are calls for new tax on e-cigarettes. However, of course, this is going to make them more expensive, and people might switch back to smoking. And as a result, they might actually have more harmful outcomes, since there might have been more medical problems related to smoking compared to e-cigarettes. But nevertheless, this kind of justifies the point about how e-cigarettes are actually cheaper, and because of that, more people would get into e-cigarettes and they would be using e-cigarettes instead of smoking. And as a result, because of the decrease or the lower price of e-cigarettes, there would be lower demand for cigarettes. So again, we can use the same example but with different names. So we got vapes, cigarettes, and breadsticks. So I would recommend smoking breadsticks instead of vapes or cigarettes. We can calculate the cross elasticity of demand between vapes and cigarettes when the price of vapes fall between these two periods. Yeah? So again, we use the formula here. XED is the percentage change in quantity demanded for good A. So in this case, the price of vapes are falling, so vapes must be good B instead of good A, and therefore cigarettes would be good A. So cigarettes, and then there will be percentage change in the price of good B, which is vapes. And then we can just pop in the numbers as usual. So we see that the cigarettes has decreased in the amount of which they're being demanded. So again, new value minus the old value divided by the old value times by 100%. Then what we get is minus 10 over 200 minus 5%. Okay, let me just recheck this. Okay, 1, 2, yeah, it should be minus 5. Tell me if I'm wrong. And then here, we've got percentage change for vapes in terms of their prices. So their prices has decreased from $8 to $6, and again, we got like 6 minus 8. Neo minus O divided by O times by 100%. So here, we're going to get, again, minus 25%. So minus 5% divided by minus 25% because both numbers are negative, we're going to get a positive number because it's a double negative. Yeah. So we're going to get 1 over 5, which is equal to 0.2, or plus 0.2 in this case. So yeah, you can see that the XED for substitutes are going to be positive, whereas the XED for complements are going to be negative. And of course, that's because that if the prices of vapes go down, then people would demand more vapes, therefore the quantity demanded for cigarettes will also go down, and therefore we get a positive number for substitutes in XED. Okay, so that's just a repeat of what we've looked at. So we can see here that not only people are smoking more e-cigarettes to kind of like replace smoking, but e-cigarettes is also a substitute for other forms of products that help people quit smoking. So we can see here that, I'm not too sure what these are actually, but probably nicotine patches and all of that stuff. So, or nicotine gum and things like that. So we can see that the usage of e-cigarettes has increased significantly because it's perceived to be slightly healthier than smoking, even though it's still bad for your health. But in general, we can see the use of e-cigarettes is increasing significantly in terms of for those who want to use a product to leave smoking or to stop smoking. So we can see that it's kind of taking away market share from these other products, and people are consuming less of these quit smoking products and consuming more of e-cigarettes to help them quit. And also we can see here that this article where it estimates the cross price elasticity of e-cigarettes and smoking cigarettes, that there is a positive cross price elasticity between the two goods. So in a sense, our assumption and our hypothesis has been validated, even though the relationship isn't very strong. So we'll look into what this number actually means later. But for now, let's just remember, if XED is positive, then it's going to be a substitute. And if it's negative, it's going to be a complement, or complementary goods. Okay. But what if XED is equal to 0? So in what case would XED be equal to 0? If we look at the formula again, XED is equal to percentage change in quantity demanded for A or percentage change in price for B, right? So if XED is 0, that means that the top must be 0. So it shows that no matter what your price change for one good is, it's not going to change the quantity of the other good. So that means there actually just isn't a relationship between the two products. So for example, if we look at toilet paper and flares, you're not going to buy more toilet paper because flares got cheaper. Or similarly, you're not going to buy more flares because toilet paper is cheaper. So in this case, the products are unrelated, they are not substitutes, and they are not complements. Therefore, the XED would be equal to 0. Yeah. So even if the demand for both products might increase in a zombie apocalypse because we love hoarding toilet paper and we need flares to signal to the military that we're still alive, those two goods would still be unrelated because the consumption of one of them would not cause you to consume the other. Simply put. Okay, so now let's look at the number of XED and what that means. So in this case, we see that XED for both of these things are positive. So what relationship do they have? I'll give you 3 seconds. So if they're positive, they're going to be substitutes, right? And that makes sense because if you buy more ballpoint pens, you probably would buy less fountain pens. And similarly, if you buy more noodles, you might buy less potatoes because they're both carbs, right? Now in this case, we can see that the number is greater for ballpoint pens and fountain pens. This just means that they are a closer substitute for one another. So you're more likely to not buy ballpoint pens when you have a fountain pen compared to having noodles and not buying potatoes, because in essence, potatoes and noodles are comparatively different products. So even though one might substitute the other, you might eat noodles instead of potatoes, but you won't replace all of them entirely, or you won't replace them as often or as much, since they might serve a different function in different dishes, right? Whereas for fountain pens and ballpoint pens, most likely if you have one, you definitely don't need the other. That's why the number here is much greater. And when the number is bigger, it just means that the quantity is much more sensitive to the price, right? So again, if we look at the formula, so let's just say this is ballpoint pen, BP, and then this is fountain pen. So to have a very big XED or a big XED number, that means the percentage change in the quantity needs to be much greater than the percentage change in the price. So just a small change or a small decrease in the price of fountain pens would mean that more people are buying fountain pens, and also a lot less people would be buying ballpoint pens because they already got fountain pens. So this just means that they're a very close substitute and they can replace each other almost entirely or very fully. Whereas for noodles and potatoes, they can replace each other but not as fully. Yeah, so we looked at this. And the same thing goes for complements as well. So if you have like a small negative number, like minus 0.5, versus a big negative number, like minus 2. So minus 0.5 might be lettuce and tomatoes, because they go well together in salads mostly, but not in other dishes. So you don't necessarily have to have it both goods at the same time, but say if it's for printer and printer ink, they would be much closer complements and they would affect each other much more. And that's because you must need one in order to consume the other. So the relationship or the complementary relationship is stronger compared to, say, lettuce and tomatoes. So that's how you would interpret the number here. And try not to interpret the number with the negative sign because it would just confuse you. So just interpret the absolute number. So if 2 is greater than 0.5, then that means they have a closer relationship. Okay, so if we want to draw XED and its effects on an economic diagram, we can look at the two diagrams here. So we've got good A and we've got good B. And let's put on some names as well. So we've mentioned that, say, the price of good B decreases, say fountain pens. I actually don't really like fountain pens. You kind of get ink everywhere. I guess it's quite good for signing documents and stuff, and it feels like, makes you feel like a boss, right? Whereas for ballpoint pens, you won't feel as much as a boss. Now I want to talk about steak now. Let's not use pens. Let's do steak. Maybe Argentinian steak. So let's say we've got two products. We've got US ribeye and Argentinian steak. So if the price of Argentinian steak decreases, which is unlikely because of the massive inflation, but if it decreases, then we would buy more Argentinian steak, right? Because it's cheaper, and we would like steak. Who doesn't like steak unless you're vegan? So if price of steak in Argentina decreases, then the quantity would increase. And since we are buying more Argentinian steak, it means that we're buying less US ribeye as well. So we can see that demand for US ribeye has decreased from D2 to D1. Yeah. So this is just to illustrate how when two goods are substitutes of one another, the decrease in price of one good would actually cause people to buy less of the other good. Because if I already have Argentinian steak, why would I want US ribeye? Because it's much tastier. Argentinian steak, come on. But it also works the other way around. So say because of the crazy inflation in Argentina, if the price of Argentinian steak increases, we would buy less Argentinian steak, and then we would buy more US ribeye in order to compensate for our demand for beef. Okay, cool. Oh, thanks for following. Hoi moi to goi. That's an interesting name. I'm not sure if I pronounced it right. Hoi moi to goi. Nice. So we're just looking at elasticities between different products at the moment. Yo. So how can businesses utilize cross elasticity of demand? So in general, what cross elasticity of demand is just the relationship between the different products, right? So whether they complement each other or they replace each other. So in general, if we go back to the previous example of Argentinian beef and US ribeye, so we know that these two products actually replace each other because they're both beef, right? Even though that they're from different countries. Then perhaps a supplier or business, instead of selling these two products in conjunction with each other, they might sell Argentinian beef and pork instead of Argentinian beef and US rib beef. So in this case, there will be more products for consumers to choose from, and also they should be able to make more revenue from that. And also, if the price of Argentinian beef increases, it's not going to affect their sales of pork as much compared to if they are selling US rib beef. So we can see how the relationship between different products can actually help in business and for firms. So companies would tend to identify products with negative XED to sell together because there would be complements. Like printers and printer ink, companies would like to sell products that work together to increase their revenue, because if you buy one thing, you would buy another. And they would do the opposite way around for products that replace each other. And then, yeah, so they will also enter into a market with little competition, and they might also offer goods with positive XED values for goods that are complementary. If I am a company trying to enter into the world of business and I'm thinking of what to produce, but I know that these iPhones are selling pretty well, so like, I don't know, maybe 50 million people might have like iPhones or something. So because of that, I would want to sell a type of product that complements these iPhones. So what other products do iPhone owners need? And one example of which is, of course, iPhone cases. So let's just say this is an iPhone case, a Lego iPhone case. Yeah. And so because I know that these two types of goods are complements to each other, so if people buy more iPhones, they will need more iPhone cases. Therefore, I know the XED value, the cross elasticity of demand between these two products, then I would opt to enter the market and offer these iPhone cases. Yeah. So I'm just writing these out in case people don't know what the drawing is. So iPhone cases and iPhones. So this is another way that businesses might use elasticity and the relationship between two goods in order to increase their profits. So that's pretty much it for cross elasticity of demand. And now we'll look at price elasticity of supply. So PES, I still have PED here, that's not good. So PES measures how responsive suppliers are to a change in the market price. So normally we would expect suppliers to supply more of their product if the market price goes up. That's because they would make more profits. And PES, or the elasticity of supply, measures how responsive and how quickly they can respond to a change in the market price. So whether they can increase their production very quickly or they can decrease their production very quickly if the market price goes down. So the formula for PES is the percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. So note that the quantity always goes on top for all the elasticity formulas. Yeah, so that's kind of like a handy way for you to remember. And so let's look at an example for this. Recently you might have heard in the news that they've got like a negative oil price. So we've talked about this a little bit in our first elasticity lesson. And one of the reasons why is that the supply of oil is very inelastic. So if you install an oil rig, it's going to continuously pump up oil from the ground and you can't stop it. Or it will be very expensive to stop the oil rig from pumping it, because I guess it's kind of to do with geothermal pressure, like the pressure of the crust of the earth. I'm not too sure, but I guess if you just stop it, then like the oil will like spill out. So it's expensive to shut it down, and therefore, even though the price is negative for oil, people would still pump oil out, even though they're making a loss. So, you're heading to bed. So, I hope you have a good night's sleep. I'm sure thanks. I hope I'm helping people. I need more viewers. Thanks for following, though. I definitely moving towards the 50 follower goal. Tell your friends about me and sleep well. Thanks for coming. Homoi Togoy, love your name. Okay, so yeah, we can see how having an inelastic supply might be bad for the firm, because if you keep producing when you're making a loss, that means you're going to make more losses. So let's try to put this in numbers. So we got like the oil cans here. This is crude oil. This is a drop of very expensive crude oil. Oh, the sunlight. I'm a vampire, I can't see sunlight. So we've got the different prices. Actually, the price of crude oil has increased recently from April to June, and I've checked. So the price has increased from $20 per barrel to $40 per barrel. And of course, if the price increases, the quantity supplied of the number of barrels would increase as well. So we can calculate the price elasticity of supply for crude oil in this case. So how sensitive or how much suppliers would supply more given the significant increase in price. So in order to do that, we will do this. So actually, let's just use this slide. So to start, we need to calculate the percentage change for the price and the percentage change for the quantity supplied. So if we use the formula, PES equals percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in the price, right? And we know the percentage change in quantity supplied is the new value, which is 1.1 million barrels minus the old value of 1 million barrels divided by 1 million barrels, and then we times it by 100%. So that's how you calculate percentage change. New minus old divided by old times 100%, and then we would get positive 10%. Right? And similarly, we do the same thing for the percentage change in price. So price has increased from $20 to $40. So we get the new $40 minus 20 over 20 times by 100%. So we would get 100%. Therefore, the PES in this case is going to be plus 10% over 100%. So that would equal to plus 0.1. And we can see that if PES is under 1, that means that it is inelastic. And therefore, this example actually shows that the quantity supplied for crude oil does not actually increase significantly, even though there's a huge increase in the price. Meaning the oil rigs cannot suddenly increase their supply sharply. Again, because they would keep pumping up oil. You can't suddenly increase the rate at which they're pumping up oil to like 100 gallons or whatever. So in general, the elasticity for commodities like oil and like even wheat and other natural resources tend to be quite inelastic, and that's because you can't suddenly increase the supply. It takes time to grow wheat, it takes time to grow things like cotton, and it takes time for you to mine coal or to mine gold and things like that. So it's good to have like a preconception of that. So as we can see here in the next slide, similar to PED, if it's greater than 1, it means that supply is elastic. And if it's smaller than 1, it means that it is inelastic. So I'll use that PES. Yeah. And yeah, we got here plus 0.1. Okay, cool. Oh, one more thing. So when you calculate the price elasticity of supply, it's always going to be positive. And the reason for that is because the percentage change are expected to have the same sign. So what I mean is, if prices increases, then of course people want to supply more. That's just the law of supply. Then you would have a positive PES, right? And similarly, if your market price decreases in terms of the percentage, and then you would have a decrease in the quantity as well. So then you would have a negative percentage change for both of them. And then again, you would have a positive PES. So as long as the law of supply holds, the price elasticity of supply is always going to be positive. Yeah. So just keep that in mind. Okay. If we put them on economic diagrams, you would have a very steep supply curve for inelastic and a very shallow supply curve for elastic. So we can see here that if we change the price slightly, if we increase the price slightly, suppliers would supply a lot more because supply is very elastic and very responsive to the increase in the market price. But here on this other diagram, we need to increase price a lot in order to increase the quantity supplied by a little bit. So this is kind of like the case for the oil rigs. Even if there's a huge increase in the oil price, we can't suddenly supply a lot more oil. Okay, cool. So this will be relevant to the next example here that we're going to talk about. One of the reasons for the huge increase in housing prices recently, I mean not recently, but like for the past 10, 20 years, such that our generation won't be able to buy any houses, even though all the boomers got their houses. So I'm not hating on them, but I'm just trying to explain the situation. The increase in house prices has been consistent throughout this period in the past like 20-40 years. So we can see from 1996 to 2006, the percentage increase in the house prices is very similar to the increase from 2012 to 2019. Yeah. However, when we look at like the building permits, so the more building permits being given, the more houses are being built, supposedly. We can see that in 1996 to 2006, the number of building permits being issued is much greater compared to the last 10 years in 2012 to 2019. So what does this mean? This means that the elasticity of US housing supply is most likely decreasing. So it's becoming more and more inelastic. And that's because even though there is a similar amount of the price increase in the property, there isn't as big as an increase in the quantity supplied or in the number of building permits in the market. And this is quite bad. Why? Because if we look at the previous figure here, if you've got an elastic supply like this, I can't see, okay, here. If you've got an elastic supply like this, then when your demand increases for housing, the price only increases slightly, so housing won't be very expensive. But if your supply is very inelastic and your demand for housing increases, like in the US, then as a result, the increase in housing prices is going to be much more significant when you have an inelastic supply and your demand is increasing. So this would translate into a much higher price for housing, and of course that's not necessarily good for the economy and wealth equality. So that's why the elasticity of supply can sometimes be quite important, such as in the US housing market. And we can see here from what they have, from their results, that there's a decline in elasticity from positive 2.63, so that's quite elastic actually, and during 1996 to 2006, and now it's only 1.75. So it's still elastic because it's bigger than 1, but much less elastic than compared to before. So if we compare that situation with the UK, one of the reasons why the land is so inelastic is because of the land use policy. So the land use policy determines what type of properties can be built on that land. For example, if the land use policy for that piece of land is commercial, then you can only build like offices or like restaurants on top of that land. Whereas if it's residential, then you can build like homes on top of that land, right? And because the land use policy is quite strict, and there's a lot of power for local residents to stop the development plans in Commonwealth countries, this kind of restricted the amount of supply and the elasticity of supply for homes. And as a result, it would cause a faster growth in house prices. So potentially, this might be some of the things that our politicians are perhaps doing. They might be trying to reclassify the types of land and the land use, because a lot of what is called green belt land isn't actually parks and green land, but it's just like places or areas or parking lots that are just like next to tube stations in big cities. So in that sense, perhaps we can have a lot more new homes and reduce the housing prices in the UK. And now let's look a bit on the determinants of PES. So what determines how elastic supply is? Or if I phrase this statement differently, what determines how sensitive or how flexible the suppliers can respond to a change in the market price? So if we've got a large amount of inventory or a large amount of stock, that means that the supplier can just quickly open up their warehouses and sell more of their product into the market. This would mean that supply would be more elastic. So to give an example, if we've got a lot of, say, masks because we're in a coronavirus crisis, if we had stored a lot of masks, and if our manufacturers have stored a lot of toilet paper in warehouses before the crisis, then we probably won't run out of toilet paper, right? Because if the price of toilet paper increases, then they would just open up those warehouses and sell those toilet paper out into the market, and they'll be able to make higher profits, and they would continue to supply toilet paper. But of course, that's not the case, as you will see later. So this is one of the factors of how flexible suppliers can be in responsive to the market price. So the more finished products stored somewhere, then the more flexible they are. Another factor would be the spare capacity. So the more capacity they have, then that means they'll be able to ramp up production, and they would have a more elastic price elasticity of supply. So what do I mean by that? Let's say if your toilet paper factory is only producing at 60% capacity, then when the market price goes up for toilet paper, then you can just quickly increase the production to 80% of your factory, or 100% of your toilet paper factory. So in this case, you might be able to produce more rolls, right? And therefore, you would be more flexible to the change in the market price and more responsive to the change in the market price. So having more spare capacity would make you more elastic, or would make the price elasticity of supply more elastic. Third factor, factors of production mobility and ease of substitution. So what is factors of production? If you recall, it is things like labor, capital, and labor just means the number of people you employ, and like slave labor, and capital would be like the machines that you have that help you make toilet paper. So if it is easier to replace the machines with people, or if it is easier to replace the people with machines when in the process of toilet paper production, then as a result, you're going to be able to be more responsive to the market price. Because if your firm or your company is already at 100% capacity, but you want to increase the production because the toilet paper price has increased by 2 times, then you can just focus on hiring one type of factors of production, which might be easier to get than having a combination of both. So if it is easier to substitute one factor of production for the other, so if you can just use people instead of machines to make toilet paper, then you would be more elastic and you would be more flexible to the market price. But in some industry, it's impossible, right? You cannot have an entirely manual process in the production of cars because there's like so many car parts. So you must need some machines. Then in that case, you would be less flexible, or your supply would be less elastic. And similarly, you also need to look into how easy it is to hire more people or buy those machines. So if the things that you're producing is much easier to get raw materials or to get the machines that help assemble those raw materials together, then again you'll be more elastic because you can quickly acquire more of those supplies and ramp up your production chain or expand your factory. Vice versa. And finally, the final factor is the time period. So the longer period of time you have, then the more production methods would become viable. And of course, that would make you more elastic. Because if you figure out new ways to do stuff, then again, you'll be more flexible in the way you produce your good. And therefore, you might be able to produce more when the market price becomes higher. Similarly, if the time period for production of your product is quite low, so like masks or toilet paper, it's easier to ramp up your production and to change your production schedule to fit everything. Yeah. So then as a result, again, you'll be more flexible and more responsive to the increase or decrease in market prices. Okay, so I guess I'm moving towards the light at the moment. I don't want to die yet, but I do want to take a 5-minute break. Okay, so yeah, let's look at this news first. So basically during COVID, a lot of our supply chains are based on just-in-time inventory system. So what just-in-time inventory systems mean is that the companies will only produce the good when they have received orders to. So they won't store any extra toilet paper in, say, warehouses and stuff. Because if they don't store toilet paper in those warehouses, this means that they can save up on the cost of renting that warehouse, right? So this would help them increase efficiency and reduce costs. So this is what that means by having a just-in-time production system. So once you get the orders for their good, then you produce it, not that you have it in stock. And as a result, during the coronavirus crisis, we ran out of expendable items very quickly, like PPE, ventilators, masks, and all of that stuff. And because we don't have extra stock in order to buffer for the sudden increase in demand for these medical products. So that is the reason why we see pasta not on shelves, we see the lack of toilet paper on shelves, and all of that. So if we can add some sort of buffer or some sort of stock or extra quantity stored somewhere for toilet paper and mask and things like that, then we would be more resilient to these types of demand shocks and the sudden increase for these expendable products. And that would make our production and our supply chain stronger. And we would be able to perhaps protect ourselves better against these types of crisis and risk type scenarios. So yeah, just to see why having an elastic supply chain is actually quite important, especially during times of crisis. However, that is kind of balanced out with the efficiency and the cost savings with just-in-time production. And here we can see like the different supply elasticities for different products. So we've got heating oil, gasoline, tobacco, and all of that stuff. So in general, we see housing is elastic. We've kind of looked at that. For agricultural or commodity products like cotton, tends to be quite inelastic. So in the short run, we can't suddenly grow more cotton trees, for example. But of course, in the long run, again, given the time period, the longer the time period, the more trees we can grow, and maybe we can make some more synthetic cotton, then it will be more elastic in the long run. So for manufactured products or like secondary goods, they tend to be slightly more elastic because we can produce more of that relatively quickly. And for things like land, or for some special products, these are perfectly inelastic. Yeah? So if it's zero, it's perfectly inelastic. So no matter how you increase the market price, you're not going to increase the quantity supplied. because if it's equal to 0, that means the change in the quantity supplied is equal to 0. So no matter how the market price changes, you won't increase or decrease the quantity supplied of land, because that's just all there is. I mean, you can't increase the amount of land on Earth. That is unless if you do land reclamation. So land reclamation is something that's done in Hong Kong and a lot of places where there isn't a lot of like land and where land is scarce and expensive. What they do is that they dump a lot of dirt into the ocean so that there would be new land, basically. So that's land reclamation. But in general, of course, you won't be able to increase the supply of land because that's all there is in your country. Yeah. So that's why the price elasticity of supply for land would tend to be 0 for some specific cases. Okay, so I'm really stepping into the light now, and I'm going to take a 5-minute break, and I'll be coming back with